Ma'am, you can't sit there. I'm sorry, I can't. Everything's spinning. Is she drunk? At this hour? Alara, table 6 needs their check. 1 second, Tanya. You don't have 1 second, we're slammed. You don't have 1 second, we're slammed. Someone move her. She's blocking the door. Just step over her. Ma'am, can you hear me? Cold. Everything's so cold. Alara, seriously, Cedric's going to lose it. Then let him. Seriously, Cedric's going to lose it. Then let him. She was already moving before she finished the sentence. Out from behind the counter, past a table of customers who leaned back like the old woman on the sidewalk was something contagious. Velora's knees gave out 3 steps from the cafe door. Alara caught her before her skull hit the stone, dropped straight down onto the pavement in her white apron, one arm braced under the woman's shoulders, the other cradling her head. I've got you, I promise. Look at me. What's your name? No answer. Just shallow breathing and eyes that wouldn't focus. Someone call an ambulance. For a homeless woman? Come on. When did you eat last, ma'am? Can you tell me that? Yesterday. Maybe. Okay. Stay with me. For one flickering half-second, something passed through the old woman's eyes that wasn't human, a flash of pale silver gone before Alara could be sure she'd seen it at all. She blinked, told herself it was the light. Alara! Cedric's voice cut through the crowd like a slammed door. He shoved past 2 customers to get to her, his face already red. What do you think you're doing? She collapsed, Cedric. She needs help, Cedric. She needs help. She needs to not be our problem. You have a section full of paying customers and you're on the ground with a... She could die. Then let the paramedics deal with that. Get up. Alara didn't move. She kept one hand pressed gently to the old woman's back, steadying her breathing, murmuring something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Across the cafe patio, a man in a long black coat stood utterly still at the edge of the sidewalk. He hadn't ordered anything. He hadn't spoken to anyone. He was simply watching, and for one instant when the light hit him wrong, his eyes weren't quite the right color for a human being. He didn't move to help. He didn't need to. He was watching to see if anyone else would. Nobody did. Except her. Alara, I swear to God, Cedric, look at her. She's barely conscious. And when this woman gets up and walks away, guess who still has an empty register and 6 angry tables? You. When this is over, don't bother coming back inside. The words landed and didn't quite register. Not yet. Alara stayed on the ground, one hand cupped around a small bottle of orange juice someone had finally thought to bring her, tilting it gently to the old woman's lips. Small sips. There you go. Slow. Color started to return to Velora's face. Her breathing steadied, and when she finally focused on the young woman kneeling beside her, really focused, like she was seeing something she hadn't expected to find, her lips moved around words too soft for anyone but Alara to catch. Such kindness. After all these centuries, Alara assumed she was confused. Delirious, maybe. She smiled anyway, the way you smile at someone frightened and disoriented, and told her she was safe now, that help was coming, that she didn't need to explain herself to anyone. She had no idea she was cradling a 1,400-year-old queen in her arms. She had no idea the man across the street had followed his mother into the city because her protective enchantment had begun, for the first time in a century, to fail. All she knew, kneeling on cold pavement in a stained apron with a job she no longer had, was that someone had needed her, and that had always been reason enough. Cedric was still shouting behind her, already turning it into a story he'd tell to justify himself later. She barely heard him. She helped Velora to her feet, steadied her, and walked her to a bench in the shade, without once looking back at the cafe doors that had just closed on the only income she had. By the time the ambulance arrived, the man in the black coat was gone. Nobody saw him leave. Nobody noticed that 3 streets away, a car door opened, and a voice that hadn't spoken gently in centuries said only 4 words to his driver. Find that waitress. You found me. Finally. Finally. The words hung there, strange and out of place, and Alara told herself she'd misheard. Shock did that. Made people say things that didn't fit. Ma'am? Can you say that again? But Velora's eyes had already fluttered shut. her breathing evening out into something safer, and the moment slipped away before Alara could hold on to it. Alara, Cedric's voice again. Closer, colder. She looked up and found half the patio staring, some with their phones already raised, recording, capturing her kneeling on the ground in a stained apron like it was entertainment. A few looked away, suddenly very interested in their coffee. Nobody moved to help her up. Nobody said a word in her defense. Except one, still weak, still trembling. Baylora's hand found Alara's wrist and gripped it with more strength than her frail body should have had. "The girl saved me," she said, quiet but clear enough for Cedric to hear every word. Cedric didn't even pause. "She cost me customers." 6 words. That was the whole of his response. No concern for the woman who'd nearly died on his patio. No flicker of anything human. Just a number in his head, a register he thought was short. A story he'd already decided to tell himself where he was the reasonable one. "You're fired, Alara. Effective now." Someone in the crowd gasped, more for the drama of it than for her. A phone tilted up to get a better angle. Alara stood slowly brushing gravel from her knees, and for one long second she considered saying everything she'd swallowed in 3 years of shifts under this man, every insult, every unpaid extra hour. Every time he'd told her that kindness didn't belong behind a register, she didn't. She untied her apron instead, folded it once, and set it on the empty chair beside her. She peeled the laminated name tag from her chest, Alara in cheap block letters, and placed it on top, careful, like she was leaving something behind that deserved more respect than it had ever been given. "Take care of her," she said, nodding toward Baylora, and then she walked away. No shouting, no parting speech, just her back to the cafe, and her feet carrying her down the street while Cedric was still talking to a crowd that had already stopped listening to him and started filming something else entirely. The walk home took 11 minutes. It felt longer. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that groaned when the wind picked up. 2 rooms and a kitchenette that doubled as a dining table when she folded down the counter extension. The lock stuck in humid weather. Today it stuck twice before it gave. "You're home early." Her brother Milo was at the small table, textbook open, a half-eaten sandwich beside it, 14 years old, and already too good at reading her face. "Yeah," she said. "Early. Why do you look like that?" "Like what?" "Like the day the school called about Mom." She didn't answer right away. She set her keys on the counter with the water stain shaped like a country neither of them could ever name, and looked at the stack of envelopes she'd been avoiding since Tuesday. Rent, overdue, second notice, red print instead of black, electric bill, Milo's school fees, due in 12 days. "I got fired," she said finally, because there was no version of this she could soften for him. For what? For helping someone. Milo set his pen down. "That's not fair." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She didn't tell him about the flash of silver in the old woman's eyes, or the words that made no sense, or the way something about that entire afternoon felt like it belonged to a different, stranger world than the one she lived in. There was no room in this apartment for things that didn't have rent money attached to them. Above the small television, in a frame that had survived 3 moves, her parents smiled out at a version of the world that no longer existed, her father's arm around her mother's shoulders. Alara at 17, gap-toothed and unbothered, standing in front of them like nothing could ever touch her family. Everything had touched her family. The accident had taken both of them within 6 months of each other. Her father first, then her mother, worn down by grief in a way doctors didn't have a clean word for. Alara had been 2 semesters into a nursing program when it happened. She told herself she'd go back once things settled. Things never settled. Milo needed someone to sign school forms, cook dinner, sit up during nightmares he pretended he didn't have anymore. She became the guardian because there was no one else standing in line for the job, and somewhere in that transition, the nursing program became a folder of paperwork she couldn't bring herself to throw away or finish. "We'll figure it out," she told Milo now, the same 4 words she always used, worn smooth from overuse. "We always do." He didn't look convinced. Neither was she. Across the city, in a part of it that didn't appear on any map Alara had ever seen, a black car idled outside a private terminal. A man stepped into the back seat without a word to his driver, his coat settling around him like something with its own weight, its own memory. For half a second his eyes caught the streetlight wrong, a flash of deep crimson, gone as quickly as it came. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, quiet enough that the driver had to lean in to catch it. "Find the waitress." The car pulled away into traffic, and no one, least of all Alara, 3 streets over, staring at a stack of overdue bills, had any idea that the search had already begun. The palace didn't appear on any map, human or otherwise. It sat beneath the old quarter of the city, past doors that looked like maintenance entrances and hallways that bent in directions architecture shouldn't allow, until stone gave way to something older, marble veined with black, torches that burned without smoke, ceilings lost in shadow high overhead. King Zephyrin Dustmere sat alone in a chamber at its center, one hand resting on the arm of a throne he rarely used for its intended purpose. More often, it was simply the place he thought best. He was over 3,000 years old. Every supernatural race on the continent knew his name and lowered their voice when they said it. Vampires, werewolves, witches, the old bloodlines that predated all 3. He had built the Eternal Night Kingdom from centuries of war and held it together through centuries more of careful, deliberate peace. He did not raise his voice. He rarely needed to. Fear did not require volume when it had 3 millennia of proof behind it. But the calm that surrounded him wasn't cruelty. It was restraint, the particular stillness of someone who had long ago learned that power unused was more persuasive than power spent. Tonight, that stillness had cracked. He had followed his mother into the human world the moment he felt her enchantment weakening, and he had watched silent, unmoving, invisible in the way only the very old could manage, as she collapsed on a stranger's sidewalk. He had watched a young woman in a red uniform break every rule of her employment to catch her. He had watched a manager fire that same woman in front of a crowd that did nothing. He was still watching it in his mind when the doors opened and his mother was brought in. Velora walked on her own power now, though slowly. 2 attendants hovering close enough to catch her if the last of the weakness returned. The disguise spell that had aged her, dulled her, hidden a 1,400-year-old queen inside the body of a frail wanderer, had finally, fully failed. Color had returned to her face. Something sharper had returned to her eyes. Something sharper had returned to her eyes. "Mother," Zephyron rose. "You should be resting. I've rested enough for 1 century. She waved off the attendants and settled into the seat across from him, folding her hands the way she always had, even 1,000 years ago, even before either of them had crowns to worry about. "I need to speak with you, before you decide anything without me." "I've decided nothing yet." "You have. I can see it in your jaw." He didn't deny it. "Why were you out there, Mother?" "Alone, unguarded, with a spell that could fail at any moment." "You know what could have happened." "I know exactly what could have happened," Velora said. "That was the point. He waited." "I wanted to see," she continued, "whether kindness still existed out there. Real kindness. Not the kind performed for reward. Not the kind that comes with an audience. The kind that costs something and gets given anyway. I watched humans for 3 centuries from behind glass and guards and titles. I wanted, once before I'm gone, to walk among them as nothing, as no one. And most of them stepped over me." Her voice didn't waver, though something old and tired moved behind it. "A woman about to die on the ground, and most of them stepped over me like I was debris in their way. 1 person didn't." Zephyron said nothing. He didn't need to ask who. "Her name is Alara," Velora said. "She left her post. She ignored every order screamed at her, and she held my head so it wouldn't hit the stone. She gave me water. She asked my name before she asked anything about herself." A pause. "She protected me before she knew my name, Zephyrin. Before she had any reason to. And her manager fired her for it, in front of everyone, without a second of hesitation." The chamber went quiet in a way that felt different from the silence Zephyrin usually kept. "She lost her position," Velora said. "Her income. In this city, at this time of year. That isn't a small thing for someone like her. I understand she has a younger brother. A home that isn't easy to keep." Zephyrin's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A stillness that had gone from measured to something closer to controlled anger. The kind that had ended wars in centuries past when it finally moved. "She lost everything," he said slowly, for a stranger who couldn't even thank her by name. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment, turning the information over the way he turned over everything, carefully from every angle. the habit of a mind that had made too many irreversible decisions too quickly in its early centuries and had spent the rest of its existence correcting for it. Before tomorrow's sunset, he said finally, her life changes. Elora studied her son's face. She had seen him make promises to kings, to councils, to enemies who no longer existed because of what came after those promises. She had never seen him make one quite like this. You'll send someone to find her? No. He stood, his coat settling around him with the same quiet weight it always carried. I'll go myself. As the king? No, Zephyrin said, and for the first time that night, something almost like warmth moved through his voice. As a man. She didn't help you because of a crown, Mother. I won't insult what she did by offering her one first. He turned toward the door, already composing, in the silence that followed, exactly what he would say to a waitress who had no idea her entire world was about to change. 3 days after the cafe, Alara had learned exactly how many ways there were to hear the word no. We're not hiring right now, but we'll keep your resume on file. You don't have food service certification from the last 2 years. That's a problem for us. I have to be honest with you. Someone let go for cause doesn't usually get a call back from us. That last one stung the most, because Cedric's version of events had apparently made its way further than she'd expected. Let go for cause. As if catching a dying woman was a violation worth flagging on a background check. By Thursday, she'd applied to 11 places. 2 called back. Neither offered anything. The bills didn't pause to wait for her luck to change. The overdue rent notice had gone from red print to a phone call, polite but firm, reminding her that patience had a limit attached to it. Milo's school fees were due in 9 days now, not 12. The number shrinking every time she looked at the calendar like it was mocking her. She sat on a bench in the small park 2 blocks from her building, resume folder on her lap, staring at nothing in particular, when a shadow fell across the page. Excuse me, are you Ilara Ashwin? She looked up. The man standing over her was tall, dressed in a dark coat that looked too well made for a public park on a Thursday afternoon, his expression calm in a way that made her instinctively straighten. There was something old about his stillness, though she couldn't have said why she thought that. Depends who's asking, she said, because 3 days of rejection had made her cautious. My name is Zephyron. He said it simply, without title, without the weight she would have expected if she'd known what came attached to it. I wanted to thank you for what you did outside the cafe. Something in her chest went tight. You saw that? I did. Is she the woman? Is she okay? She's well, Zephyron said. Better than well, actually. She hasn't stopped talking about you? Alara felt heat rise in her face, embarrassment more than pride. I didn't do anything special. She was on the ground. Anyone would have, would they? The question landed simply, without accusation, but it stopped her mid-sentence. She thought of the customers who'd stepped backward, the ones who'd filmed instead of helped. The manager who'd fired her before the ambulance had even arrived. I only did what anyone should, she said finally, quieter than before. That's rarely the case, Zephyrin said. In my experience, it's a very small number of people who actually do it. He sat on the far end of the bench, close enough to speak comfortably, far enough not to crowd her. A small courtesy she noticed without quite understanding why it registered. I'd like to help you, he said, in whatever way would matter most. What do you need? Truly need? Alara let out something between a laugh and a breath. A job would be a start. That's not what I asked. She looked at him properly then, the careful way he phrased things, like every sentence had been considered twice before it left his mouth. I don't need charity. I don't even know you. It isn't charity. Consider it a debt. You gave something to someone who couldn't repay you at the time. I'm simply here to correct that. I don't want money, she said, and meant it, even as the number on her rent notice sat heavy in her mind. Money doesn't fix what's actually wrong. Then tell me what is actually wrong. Then tell me what is actually wrong. She hadn't meant to answer honestly. It came out anyway, the way things did sometimes with strangers, precisely because they were strangers. No history, no expectations, nothing to protect. I was 2 years into a nursing program, she said. Central program. Good one. Then my parents died 6 months apart, and there wasn't anyone else to look after my brother. So I stopped. Got a job that paid enough to keep the lights on, and I told myself I'd go back eventually. She looked down at the resume folder in her lap. Eventually became 5 years. Zephyrin was quiet for a moment, watching her with an attention that felt different from how most people listened. Not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually weighing what she'd said. You wanted to help people, he said. That was the reason you chose nursing. Yeah, she hadn't said that part out loud in a long time. I used to think I could do something that mattered. Instead, I spent 5 years refilling coffee and getting fired for the one time I actually did something that mattered. That's not a small thing you gave up, Zephyrin said. Most people would resent the family that cost them that dream. He's not the reason I lost it. He's the reason I don't regret it. Something shifted in Zephyrin's expression. Subtle, but real. Like she'd said something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure how to respond to right away. I have a proposition for you, he said finally. Not payment, not a gift. An opportunity that I think matches exactly who you are if you're willing to hear it. I'm listening. He smiled then. Small, unreadable, the first real warmth she'd seen from him since he'd sat down. I believe, he said quietly, you're ready to meet my family. I believe you're ready to meet my family. Alara laughed before she could stop herself. A short, disbelieving sound. Meet your family? I don't even know your last name. Duskmere, he said simply, and I'd rather show you than explain it. Would you come with me? Every instinct she'd built over 5 years of caution told her to say no to a stranger's car, a stranger's address, a stranger's family she'd never heard of, but something about the stillness in him, the same stillness she'd noticed across the street outside the cafe, she realized suddenly with a small jolt, made the refusal die in her throat. Just to meet them, she said. That's all, he agreed. The car that came for them an hour later was long, black, and quiet in a way that had nothing to do with soundproofing. The estate it delivered them to sat behind a wall of old trees on the edge of the city, a house that looked less like wealth and more like history, stone that had clearly stood for centuries, ivy, grown deliberate, rather than neglected windows, lit gold against the coming evening. Alara had expected a benefactor, a wealthy family with more money than sense, wanting to make themselves feel better about a stranger's suffering by writing a check and calling it done. She braced herself for that kind of transaction, the kind where gratitude came with strings she wasn't sure she wanted attached. She was not prepared for the woman who walked out to meet them. Alara. The voice was familiar, impossibly familiar, but the woman speaking it was not the frail, collapsing stranger from the cafe floor. This woman stood straight-backed, unlined, her hair a deep silver black rather than the thin gray Alara remembered, dressed in something that looked less like clothing and more like a statement. Centuries younger, somehow, though that thought made no sense at all. Healthy, elegant, regal in a way that had nothing to do with posture lessons. I don't. Alara's voice came out unsteady. I'm sorry, I think I have the wrong you look like. I am her, Valora said gently. The illusion is gone now. This is what I actually look like, Alara. What I've always looked like, beneath what you saw that day. Alara took a step back. That's not possible. You could barely breathe. You were 80, maybe older, and now you're older than you can imagine, Valora said. And younger than I appear tonight. In truth, will you come inside? I promise this will make more sense with time, though I understand if it doesn't feel that way right now. Alara looked at Zephyrin, searching his face for the joke, the explanation, anything that would make the last 30 seconds fold back into something ordinary. He offered none of it, just watched her with the same patient stillness as before. She went inside because leaving felt, somehow, harder than staying. The room they led her to was warm, candlelit, quiet in a way that felt deliberate, rather than empty. Valora sat across from her, hands folded, and told her everything, slowly, plainly, without theatrics, as though the truth needed no embellishment to be believed. She was the former queen of the Eternal Night Kingdom, 1470 years old, though her body carried none of that weight tonight. The disguise that had made her appear elderly and human had been her own choice, cast deliberately so she could walk unnoticed among mortals and see before she considered her long life finished, whether real kindness still existed in a world that had grown so practiced at performing it. Most people stepped over me, Valora said. You did not. And Lara looked toward Zephyrin, feeling something cold settle low in her stomach. You said family. He's my son, Phalora said. King Zephyrin Duskmere, ruler of the eternal Night Kingdom, immortal in the way our kind understands the word, feared, respected, and, I promise you, entirely real. The room tilted, just slightly. Alara pressed her palm flat against the arm of the chair, grounding herself against wood that felt, at least, solid and ordinary. This isn't, I need to go. She stood too fast, the chair scraping back. I don't know what this is, some kind of elaborate. I have a brother waiting for me. I have bills. I have a life that doesn't have room for. Her voice cracked slightly. For whatever this is, Alara. Zephyron's voice calm, steady, no urgency in it at all. You're not obligated to believe any of it tonight. You're not obligated to stay. I don't understand what you want from me. Nothing, he said. That's what I need you to hear, more than anything else. You owe us nothing. Not your belief, not your gratitude, not your time. What you did for my mother, you did before you knew any of this. It doesn't require repayment. And it certainly doesn't require you to sit in a room with strangers claiming things that sound impossible. Something in his voice, the total absence of pressure, of expectation, made her pause halfway to the door. Then why am I here? Because I wanted you to know the truth, he said, before I offered you anything built on it. It seemed dishonest to do otherwise. She stood there a long moment, caught between the door and the room, between the ordinary life waiting for her 3 streets over and whatever impossible thing was unfolding in front of her. Then, Zephyrin did something that stopped her breath entirely. He knelt. Not a polite bow, not a nod of respect. He lowered himself fully to one knee in front of her, a king in front of a waitress in a borrowed coat, and looked up at her with an expression that held nothing but sincerity. Thank you, he said quietly, for protecting my mother before you had any reason to. Whatever you decide tonight, that debt is real, and it is mine to honor. Thank you, he said quietly, for protecting my mother before you had any reason to. Whatever you decide tonight, that debt is real, and it is mine to honor. Alara stared down at him, a king kneeling in front of her in a room lit by candlelight, and found she couldn't make her voice work for several seconds. Please, she finally managed. Stand up. This feels. She shook her head. This feels wrong. You don't need to do that. I know I don't need to. He rose, unhurried, and something in his expression had softened, the careful reserve from earlier giving way to something more direct. That's precisely why I did. She sat back down slowly, not because the panic had passed, but because standing suddenly felt like more effort than it was worth. Phalora watched the exchange with quiet approval, saying nothing, letting her son carry the moment. I still don't understand what any of this has to do with me, Alara said. You've thanked me. That's more than enough. I don't need anything else. May I ask you something? Zephyrin said. Not as an obligation, just a question. She nodded, cautious. What future did you surrender? The question landed somewhere she hadn't expected, somewhere she kept locked most days, because it didn't help to open it. I don't know what you mean. You told me in the park you wanted to help people, that you chose nursing for a reason. I don't think that reason disappeared just because your circumstances changed. He watched her carefully. What did you actually want to become? Alara looked at her hands for a long moment before she answered. A humanitarian, I guess. That sounds grand when I say it like that. A small, humorless laugh. I wanted to work somewhere that mattered. Somewhere I could actually change something instead of just managing it. Advocacy work, maybe. Mediation between people who couldn't hear each other otherwise. Social work, if none of that worked out. I had a whole plan once. Internships lined up. A path. She shrugged, the gesture smaller than the loss it was covering. Then my parents died, and the path became keeping my brother fed and in school, and somewhere along the way, I stopped letting myself think about the rest of it. It felt selfish to want more when he needed so much. It was never selfish, Zephyrin said. It was buried. There's a difference. She didn't answer that. I'd like to offer you something, he continued. Not money, though you'll want for nothing. Not a title, though one will likely come with time. I'd like to offer you the thing you actually surrendered, which is purpose. He said the word plainly, without theater. Education. fully funded in whatever direction serves the work you actually want to do. A permanent position within the kingdom's diplomatic office, building the first real framework of cooperation between the human world and ours. Resources most humanitarian organizations only dream of having, and security for your brother, his schooling, his home, his future, guaranteed regardless of what you decide about your own. Alara felt something crack slightly behind her ribs. Not pain exactly, but the particular ache of hearing a dream spoken aloud after years of pretending it didn't exist. "That's not a small offer," she said quietly. "No, it isn't. I can't accept that." "Why not?" "Because I don't know the first thing about diplomacy between humans and—" She gestured vaguely, still not entirely comfortable with the word "whatever you are." "Vampires. Kingdoms. I waited tables for 5 years. What happens when I fail at this? What happens to Milo if I take some enormous position I'm not qualified for and it falls apart?" "You catch strangers before they hit the ground," Zephyron said. "You held your ground against a man screaming at you in front of a crowd because you believed you were right. I don't think failure looks the way you're imagining it. You don't know me well enough to say that." "I know enough." She stood, restless, walking a small distance toward the window rather than sitting still with the offer pressing against her. "I'm 25. I have a 14-year-old brother who needs me home, not off learning some new life in a world I don't understand. I don't have room to be someone's project." "You wouldn't be a project," Veilora said gently, speaking for the first time in several minutes. "You'd be exactly what you were the day you knelt beside me, someone choosing to help, on your own terms. Nothing about that changes." Alara didn't answer. She left not long after, quiet, unsettled, promising nothing. She found Milo at the kitchen table when she got home. Homework abandoned, waiting up despite the hour. "You're back late," he said. "Where'd you go?" She told him, carefully, in pieces, watching his face for signs that he thought she'd lost her mind. He didn't look at her like that. He listened the way he always did, patient beyond his years, until she reached the offer and trailed off. "So what's the problem?" he asked. "The problem is, I'd be starting over, at 25, with a 14-year-old to raise and no idea what I'm doing." "You didn't know what you were doing when Mom and Dad died either," Milo said quietly. "You figured it out anyway." She had no answer for that. "You always tell me not to give up on stuff just because it's scary," he continued. "You gave up your whole life for me, and you never once made me feel bad about it. Maybe it's my turn to tell you not to give up on yours." "Milo, Mom and Dad would have wanted you to dream again," he said simply. "I want that too." "Mom and Dad would have wanted you to dream again," Milo said. "I want that too." Alara didn't answer him that night, not with words. She just pulled him into a hug that lasted longer than either of them expected and let the decision sit unspoken between them for a little while longer. She didn't know yet that somewhere across the city, a different kind of reckoning had already begun. One she'd had no hand in starting, and no way of stopping even if she'd wanted to. The rumors started small, the way they always did. A regular at Silver Oak Cafe mentioned offhand that the homeless woman who'd collapsed out front had turned out to be somebody. Nobody knew exactly who, but somebody with money, somebody with connections, somebody who mattered. A former co-worker posted a shaky video clip of Cedric shouting at Alara on the patio, captioned simply, "She saved a woman's life," and got fired for it. It had 400 views by morning. By the following afternoon, it had 400,000. Cedric noticed the shift before he understood it. Regulars who'd eaten at Silver Oak for years suddenly weren't. Reservations that used to fill every table by noon sat half empty. He told himself it was seasonal, a slow week, nothing that wouldn't correct itself. It did not correct itself. Within days, well-dressed strangers began appearing at the cafe at odd hours, not to eat, but to observe. They sat near the window, said little, watched the staff with a kind of quiet, unreadable attention that made the waitstaff uneasy without being able to say why. Cedric assumed they were reviewers or investors or competitors scouting the space. He put on his best customer service voice and got nothing back but polite, distant nods. He didn't know that each one reported, in careful detail, exactly how the staff had treated the woman who saved the Queen Mother's life, and exactly how little had changed since. Then came the investigators. Officially, they were auditors from the health department, following up on an anonymous complaint. They found what auditors always find when they finally look closely: expired inventory quietly restocked instead of discarded safety violations Cedric had been getting away with for years through a mixture of charm and bribery, records that didn't match receipts that didn't match the story he told when questioned. His business partners, once easy to reach, became harder to find. Calls went unanswered. A planned expansion into a second location quietly stalled, then died. One partner, when finally cornered, simply said, "I don't need my name anywhere near whatever this is," and hung up. Former employees, emboldened by the videos circulating online, began speaking up. Not organized, not coordinated, just one by one, people who'd worked under Cedric for years finally saying what they'd swallowed for the sake of a paycheck: the unpaid overtime, the favoritism. The way he mocked anyone who showed too much softness toward customers, the way he'd fired 2 others before Alara for similar reasons and simply never let those stories reach anyone who mattered. Now, suddenly, everyone was listening. The boycott didn't need an organizer. It grew on its own, one canceled reservation at a time, one shared video at a time, until the dining room that used to be full by noon sat nearly empty even during what should have been the dinner rush. Cedric found out the truth 3 weeks after he'd fired her, sitting alone in his office with the lights off, staring at numbers that no longer made sense, no matter how he arranged them. A man came to see him, calm, unremarkable in appearance, carrying himself with a stillness Cedric found unsettling without understanding why. He introduced himself only as a representative, and he laid it out plainly, without cruelty, without satisfaction, the way one might explain a diagnosis. The elderly homeless woman who'd collapsed outside his cafe had been Velora, Queen Mother of the Eternal Night Kingdom, 1400 years old, disguised, deliberately, to walk unnoticed among mortals, and the silent man who'd stood across the street that afternoon, watching everything unfold without a word, that had been her son, King Zephyron Duskemir, ruler of the Eternal Night Kingdom, a name Cedric had heard only in passing, in the kind of stories people told about things they didn't quite believe in, the kind of power that didn't belong in the same universe as a neighborhood cafe. Cedric's mouth opened, then closed. He tried to speak twice before anything came out. That's not possible. It is. She was homeless. She could barely stand. She was exactly who she needed to appear to be that day, the man said. And your waitress protected her before she knew any of that, before there was anything to gain from it. Cedric's legs gave out from under him. He sat down hard in his own chair, staring at nothing, the full weight of 3 weeks of unexplained collapse finally arranging itself into a shape he understood. He had fired the woman who'd saved a queen. He had screamed at her, humiliated her in front of a crowd, for the crime of doing exactly what she should have, and every consequence that had followed, every empty table, every vanished partner, every violation the inspectors had finally bothered to look for, hadn't been misfortune. It had been the world quietly, deliberately, closing in around a decision he could never take back. He didn't say anything else. He simply sat there, the office dark around him, while the man who delivered the truth let himself out without another word. Silver Oak Cafe closed for good 6 days later. No dramatic final service, no farewell notice on the door, just a padlock, a sign in the window announcing the property was under new ownership, and a for lease listing that stayed up for months without a single serious inquiry. Cedric Holloway disappeared from the neighborhood not long after, his name mentioned occasionally by former employees the way people mention a storm that's finally passed, with relief and very little sympathy left over. Cedric Holloway disappeared from the neighborhood not long after, his name mentioned occasionally by former employees the way people mention a storm that's finally passed, with relief and very little sympathy left over. Alara barely thought of him at all. She was too busy learning an entirely new language for the world. Months into her training, she still woke some mornings certain she'd imagined the whole thing, until she looked around the modest quarters the estate had given her close enough to the main house that Milo could visit after school, far enough that it felt like her own space rather than borrowed charity, and remembered that none of it had stopped being real, just because it felt impossible. Her days were unlike anything she'd known. Mornings were spent with an elderly scholar named Iresh, learning centuries of supernatural history compressed into lessons that made her head ache by noon. The old wars, the fragile treaties, The reason certain factions still eyed each other with generations-old suspicion that predated every human alive today. Afternoons were mediation practice, sitting across from advisors who challenged her with deliberately impossible scenarios, testing whether she could find fairness in disputes that had no clean answer. "You're too quick to side with the sympathetic party," Arash told her once, not unkindly. "Diplomacy isn't about who you feel for. It's about what holds." She took the correction the way she took all of them, without defensiveness, adjusting, trying again. She wasn't given anything for free here, whatever Cedric might have assumed if he'd known where she'd ended up. The vampire nobles who tested her patience in negotiation drills didn't soften their arguments, because she was new, because she was human, because the Queen Mother had taken a personal interest in her. If anything, some of them pushed harder, curious whether the story of the waitress who'd knelt on a sidewalk would hold up under real pressure. It held up. Slowly, unmistakably. It held up. She earned the trust the way trust was supposed to be earned, not handed to her because of what she'd done outside a cafe, but built session by session, disagreement by disagreement. In every moment where she chose to listen, instead of assume, to ask, instead of accuse. Rival factions who'd never agreed on anything found themselves more than once agreeing that Alara's read on a dispute was fair even when it didn't favor their own side. "She doesn't flatter either of us," one skeptical elder was overheard saying, months into her training. "That's rarer than you'd think." Valora became something Alara hadn't expected to find again. Not a benefactor, not a queen to be careful around, but something closer to family. She'd stop by Alara's quarters some evenings with tea and stories that spanned centuries, patient with every question Alara asked, gentle in a way that reminded her, achingly, of a grandmother she'd lost too young to remember well. "You remind me of someone," Valora told her once. "Not in appearance, in the way you refuse to look away from difficult things." "Is that a compliment?" "It's the highest one I have." Zephyron's presence in her life shifted slowly, without either of them naming it directly. He appeared at odd hours during her training, not checking on her, he insisted, though she noticed he always seemed to know when a session had gone badly. He'd sit with her sometimes while she works through frustration over a mediation she felt she'd handled poorly, listening the same careful way his mother did, offering perspective rather than reassurance. It wasn't the rescue on the cafe patio that stayed with him, though that had been the beginning. It was everything after. The way Alara kept choosing compassion in rooms where it cost her something, kept extending patience to nobles who tested her on purpose, kept treating every person in front of her, human or otherwise, powerful or forgotten, as someone worth genuine attention. He'd watched countless people perform kindness when it served them. He had never watched anyone simply continue being kind long after any audience had stopped paying attention. He didn't say any of this to her directly, not yet. But it lived in the way he watched her work, in the quiet respect that had slowly, unmistakably, become something warmer. The day it became official, the great hall of the estate filled with a mix Alara still found strange to witness: supernatural nobles standing beside human diplomats, factions that rarely occupied the same room without tension, all gathered for a single announcement. Zephyron stood at the center, Valora beside him, and called Elora forward. 6 months ago, he said, his voice carrying easily through the hall, a young woman knelt on a public sidewalk for a stranger she owed nothing to. She has spent every day since proving that moment wasn't an accident of circumstance, but simply who she is. Alara stood before the gathered crowd, the same discomfort she'd felt kneeling before Zephyron months ago, returning briefly, though steadier now, more sure of her place in the room than she'd once been. "It is my honor," Zephyron continued, "to name Alara Ashwin the first ambassador between humanity and the eternal Night Kingdom, a position earned, not given, through every choice she has made since the day we met." The hall erupted into applause that felt, for once, entirely genuine, humans and vampires alike. Rival factions setting aside old suspicion long enough to acknowledge what she'd built. Alara looked toward Valora, who smiled at her the way a grandmother might. Then toward Zephyron, whose expression held something quieter than pride, something he still hadn't found the words for. She didn't need him to say it yet. She could already feel it. She could already feel it. Years passed the way important things sometimes did, quietly, in the accumulation of ordinary days that turned out, in hindsight, to have been building towards something enormous. The sanctuary opened on a bright autumn morning, its doors thrown wide beneath a banner that read simply, "All are welcome here." It had taken years to build, longer to convince skeptics on both sides that it could work, longest of all to earn the trust required to make humans and vampires and werewolves and witches comfortable occupying the same halls without old suspicions curdling into new conflict. But it worked. It stood there now, stone and glass and something harder to name, proof, made physical, of everything Alara had spent years building, one difficult negotiation at a time. Inside, humans waited beside vampire elders for medical care that didn't ask which world you belonged to before offering help. Werewolf families sat with witch healers, sharing knowledge that centuries of mistrust had once kept locked behind closed borders. Every face that walked through those doors received the same answer: you will be helped, regardless of what you are. Alara stood near the entrance that first morning, watching it all unfold, feeling something settle in her chest that she hadn't expected. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter, something like relief. It happened almost too quickly to process. An elderly man near the entrance, worn coat, uncertain steps, stumbled and went down hard against the stone steps. For one suspended second, the crowd around him did exactly what crowds had always done: hesitated, unsure, waiting for someone else to move first. Alara was already running. She hit her knees beside him before anyone else had taken a single step, the same way she had years ago on a different stretch of stone, in a different life that felt both impossibly far away and close enough to touch. "I've got you," she said, exactly as she'd said it then. "Stay with me. What's your name?" The old man blinked up at her, dazed, and something in his eyes cleared slightly at the sound of her voice. Not fear, but recognition of someone who meant what she said. Nothing about her heart had changed. Not the position, not the title, not the years of diplomacy and negotiation and careful, hard-won respect. When someone needed her, she still moved before she thought. She still knelt without hesitation. She was still, underneath everything the world had given her, the same woman who'd once abandoned her post for a stranger and lost everything for it. Medical staff arrived within moments. The sanctuary's whole design ensured they always would, and the old man was carried inside, steady, safe, already receiving the same care given to everyone who walked through those doors. Alara stood, brushing dust from her knees, and found Zephyron watching her from a short distance away. He said nothing about what he'd just seen. He didn't need to. Later that evening, gathered among the sanctuary's founding leaders, nobles, diplomats, human officials who'd once considered cooperation with the supernatural world impossible, Zephyron spoke quietly, his voice carrying the same measured calm it always had. "Kingdoms endure through strength," he said. "I built mine on exactly that, for 3,000 years, because I believed strength was the only currency that mattered." He glanced toward the entrance, where Alara stood speaking gently with a young witch who'd arrived frightened and alone. "I was wrong. Civilizations endure through compassion. Strength holds a kingdom together only until it doesn't. Compassion is what convinces people, generation after generation, that the kingdom was worth holding on to in the first place." No one in the room argued with him. Far from the sanctuary in a city that had mostly forgotten his name, Cedric Holloway stood at the edge of a crowd gathered for the sanctuary's public dedication, watching a broadcast on a shop window screen he hadn't meant to stop for. He recognized her immediately, despite the years, despite the title now attached to her name, despite everything that separated the woman on the screen from the waitress he'd fired for costing him customers. He watched her kneel beside a stranger without a moment's hesitation, watched leaders from two different worlds defer to her judgment, watched, with a slow, sinking recognition, everything he'd once dismissed as weakness rebuilt into something that had reshaped an entire relationship between species. He had called her compassion a cost. He understood now, standing alone at the edge of a crowd he no longer belonged to, exactly how much it had actually been worth, and exactly how little he had left to show for choosing otherwise. He turned and walked away before the broadcast ended, and no one around him noticed him leave. At sunset, Alara stood outside the sanctuary beside Zephyron and Baelora, watching the crowd below, humans and vampires, werewolves and witches, moving together in the golden light without a single line dividing them. "You thought you lost a job that afternoon," Valora said quietly, her hand finding Alara's. "I did lose a job that afternoon." "You found your destiny," Sethiran said, and when Alara looked at him, she found none of the careful reserve he'd worn the day they met, only quiet certainty, warm and unguarded. She didn't answer right away. Below them, near the entrance, another stranger approached, hesitant, uncertain whether the doors were truly open to someone like them. Alara didn't wait to be asked. She stepped forward, the way she always had, the way she always would, and welcomed them inside. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't a debt being repaid, or a reputation being maintained, or a title living up to expectations. It was simply who she was, the same woman who'd knelt on a stranger's behalf on an ordinary afternoon, when no one was watching, when nothing was promised in return. That was the truth the whole story had been circling from its very first line. Kindness didn't require witnesses to matter. It only required someone willing to move first. Alara always had been.